Hello, everybody. My name is Courtney Clark, she, her, and I am joining you today from Uktahamguk, Newfoundland, which is the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq, and Labrador as well, which is the traditional territory of the Innu and Inuit. I also want to acknowledge that we have panelists and audience members spanning all across the country here today, inhabiting dozens of other traditional Indigenous territories. And as we open our hearts and minds to the past, at Equal Voice, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. A few quick accessibility notes. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you're going to find options to turn on live closed captioning. And within the live closed captioning, you will also find an automated language translation tool. This webinar is recorded and will be available to you in the resource section of our website as soon as possible. And when it's on the website, I will be sure to email you with the link as well as PDF copies of the presentations that you see today. So thank you so much for joining us on this virtual webinar around accessibility and childcare expenses in election campaigns. Again, my name is Courtney Clark, she, her, and I am the Senior Manager of Education with Equal Voice. Equal Voice is a multi-partisan charity that helps get more women and gender diverse individuals elected to all levels of government in Canada. We host in-person and virtual campaign schools, as well as mock campaign simulations. So if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into all matters pertaining to election campaigns, reach out to me by email at courtney@equalvoice.ca or sign up for our Equal Voice newsletter at our website. The campaign schools and other events are a great way to meet like-minded individuals, gain advice, and have conversations with elected officials and behind-the-scenes experts, and it provides you the tools you need to be successful in getting elected. Feel free to introduce yourself and where you're dialing in from in the chat. I recognize that we had a few names registered here today, some from past campaign schools and some from the webinar that Donna and I hosted 2 weeks ago on Political Finance and Fundraising 101. And for those of you who want to rewatch that or missed that session, you can find that video recording under our resource section on equalvoice.ca. This quick lunch and learn is going to take a deeper look into two new-ish offerings from Elections Canada. They've been around for a few years now, one of which is around accessibility and the other is around family care. And this is some great information for prospective and current election candidates, campaign managers, official agents, and treasurers. Over the next 60 minutes, we're going to share 3 angles to this topic. We're going to start with our partners in Democracy in Action, Elections Canada. We're once again joined by the impressive subject matter expert, Donna Beck, who is an auditor in the Political Financing Unit. She's going to take around 10 minutes to talk about accessibility and childcare in your election campaign from a Federal Elections Canada perspective. Then I'm going to come back on the screen and talk about the trends of usage in those federal accessibility and childcare expenses, the provincial and territorial accessibility and childcare offering equivalents at a provincial territorial election level. And then I'll list 10 best practices to keep in mind to make your election campaign as accessible as possible to voters and volunteers. From there, we are joined by former federal NDP candidate, Betsy MacDonald. She is joining us. She ran in the central Nova Scotia area in the 44th general election and will share their experience using the federal childcare expense. We will then take the rest of the time to answer questions from the chat. And if there's any questions that we miss, if we don't have time to answer, or they may require a bit more research before talking, we will get you the answers via email after the fact. All right, so first off, I'm going to bring up our lovely Donna Beck. So,
thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. I have a presentation that I will share with you. I just want to highlight, though, as we're going through this, that this is a very high-level view of accessibility and childcare expenses. I don't think that worked. Childcare expenses. There are a lot of rules around expenses, any category of expenses, but this is just to give you an introduction to these two newer types of expenses. Okay, so we'll be talking about candidate personal expenses under which childcare, care for a person with physical or mental incapacity, or
Oh,
expenses related to a candidate's disability.
sorry,
Is it
just to cut
showing?
it in. No.
Okay,
Gotta love technology.
there. Now it's different than it was the last.
Okay, it's showing now.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay, so we'll start with candidates' personal expenses. Sorry about that. Under which childcare, care for a person with a physical or mental incapacity, and expenses related to a candidate's disability fall. And then we all talk about accessibility expenses, and finally go on to some of the resources where you can get more details about these expense categories. Okay, so we have the specific expense categories that we've talked about for candidates' personal expenses and accessibility expenses. These are for new or additional expenses that are incurred only because there's been an election. They are not subject to the election expense limit, and they may be eligible for a partial reimbursement. So who is eligible to receive a reimbursement? A candidate's campaign can get a reimbursement if the candidate was elected or received at least 10% of the valid votes. They've submitted all the reporting on time by the original extended filing deadline, and they also must provide adequate supporting documentation for the expense to be reimbursed. And this is just an overview for these particular expense types, what kind of reimbursement rate there is. So for both expense types, there's a 90% reimbursement rate. For candidate personal expenses for childcare, care for a person with a physical or mental incapacity, or expenses related to a candidate's disability, there is no maximum reimbursement, and they're reimbursed at 90%. For accessibility expenses, there's a maximum reimbursement of $5,000. And I'll just quickly point out the paid from column. There are special rules around who can incur these expenses, each type of expense, and who can pay them. So I would recommend that you look at the Political Financing Handbook for candidates and official agents to get more details on that. So in terms of candidates' personal expenses, childcare may include daycare, babysitting services, day camps, and tutoring when these expenses have been incurred only because of an election. So we've interpreted the definition as widely as possible. So one example in terms of childcare expenses, if a candidate's child is normally in daycare during the work week and the candidate cares for the child themselves on the weekends, and then the candidate becomes involved in campaign activities during the weekend and they leave their child with a babysitter, the expense for the babysitter would be a personal expense because it was incurred because of the election. The cost of the daycare while the candidate campaigns during the week would not be a personal expense if there's no additional cost that's been incurred. The second example is a candidate normally helps their child with their homework, but campaign activities during the election are preventing them from doing that, so they've hired a tutor for 2 nights a week. The expense for this tutoring is a childcare expense. And then we'll move on to care with a person with a physical or mental incapacity. If the candidate is the person responsible for normally providing care for a person with an incapacity, additional care might be needed for times when the candidate is campaigning. The expense for the additional care would be a personal expense. And then the final related expense subcategory under personal candidate personal expenses is disability-related candidates' personal expenses. And these apply in the case where the candidate has a disability and additional expenses related to that disability have to be incurred as a result of the election. There may be overlap between the accessibility expenses, which we'll get into in a minute, and the candidate-related disability expenses. If there's an overlap between the needs of the candidate and the electors or campaign workers, you can allocate between the two expense categories on a reasonable basis. And some examples of expenses related to a candidate's disability, if they require the services of a caregiver when they travel and the caregiver accompanies the candidates on trips in the riding, the expense of this additional care would be personal expenses. And example number 2 is talking about a candidate who requires the use of accessible transportation. So they use accessible taxis to travel from home to their campaign office and to campaign events. So this would be the cost for these taxi fares would be a personal expense, and the campaign would qualify for a higher reimbursement by correctly claiming these taxi fares as personal expenses rather than travel and living, because the personal expenses related to the disability, expenses related to a disability for a candidate are reimbursed at 90%. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the categories under personal expenses. For accessibility expenses, typical accessibility expenses would include accessible websites, sign language interpretation, communication products, and adapted alternative formats, and temporary physical improvements. So some examples: an accessible website. So the campaigns created a website for use during the election period, but they run accessibility diagnostics on the site. And the diagnostics show that several of the web pages need to be recoded for accessibility. So the campaign then hires a web designer to make the improvements. The diagnostic tool and the web designer fees are accessibility expenses. Another example of for communication products and adapted alternative formats, the campaign produces a video with captioning for the candidate to promote the candidate for $1,000. Without the captioning, the video would have cost $900 to produce. So the campaign would report an election expense of $900, what it would cost to produce the video without the captions, and an accessibility expense of $100. And then the final example talks about construction and renovation. And in this case, the campaign office is in a building that's not accessible. So the campaign hires a contractor to build a temporary wooden ramp. The cost of materials and labor is $300, and that would be an accessibility expense. So again, that's a very high level overview of these expenses, just to give you an idea of what they involve or what they apply to. And for more details, you could go to the resources, the Handbook for Candidates and Official Agents. There's also a resource talking about accessibility expenses versus the disability-related personal expenses. Under candidates' personal expenses, there's online training modules for candidates, and there's also our helpline. And you can reach us by calling or by sending an email. And I'll turn it back over to Courtney.
Thank you so much, Donna. That was a great overview. I'm going to just get my slides up here real quick. Okay. So Donna did a phenomenal job explaining the various childcare, family care, and disability and accessibility related expenses available through Elections Canada. And it is so great to see Elections Canada continually working on leveling the playing field so individuals can run in federal elections and create more accessible campaigns for voters and volunteers. Equal Voice actually analyzed the number of candidates who claimed these expenses during the 44th general election in September 2021. So I want to start off by quickly breaking down the childcare usage specifically, and then the disability expense usage. So if your province or territory isn't on this pie chart, that means childcare expenses were not utilized by a federal candidate in your province in this election. In total, only 11 out of 1,947 candidates utilized the childcare expense. So that is 0.6%, not even 1%. And when I send the webinar recording to you, I'm also going to attach an infographic with some more findings and recommendations on how the support can be even made greater. Now, when we disaggregate the data a little further, you'll see that there are more male candidates who are utilizing the federal child care expense than women candidates. And when broken down by party, it's mostly utilized by the NDP, followed by the Liberals, Conservatives, and then Greens. I also want to quickly add that this male-female breakdown is quite binary, as there weren't any gender diverse folks who utilized these expenses. Similarly, we analyzed the number of candidates who claimed accessibility expenses in the 44th general election in 2021. And in total, only 20 out of 1,947 candidates, 1%, utilized the accessibility expense. Half of those candidates were from Alberta and Ontario, with a whopping 15% of usage coming from candidates in New Brunswick. And of those people, 6 were women, 14 were men. So again, we're seeing more male candidates utilize these expenses than women. Then when we break it down a little further, we can see that the accessibility expense looks to be used mostly by conservative candidates, followed closely behind by Liberals, NDP, Greens, and then one independent. We did rule out one exceptionality in this data analysis. So for the 20 that we did analyze, a quarter spent less than $100. In total, they spent around $2,600 or $26,500 across all candidates in Canada. And one of those candidates came in at spending almost $12,000. I'm going to do a quick breakdown of what we've discovered is and isn't available in provincial and territorial elections. And then I'm just going to list off 10 quick things to keep in mind to prioritize accessibility in your election campaign. All right, so let's talk about what's available at the provincial and territorial levels. This information is tough to find, and even we had some struggles getting all of the information. It's not often clear in the Act or in the guides what is considered accessibility or childcare, and this is just a starting point for you, especially depending on when you watch this video. The Acts are continually being modified, so make sure that you double check with your elections body on what is available at the time that you run, because like I said, it's always being modified. For times when the public information wasn't so clear, we did reach out to the election regulatory bodies for confirmation. Some gave detailed answers, some gave partial answers, some we haven't heard from as of today. So let's start out east, Newfoundland and Labrador, where I am. And I don't expect you to read all of this. And some of the slides have 2 or 3 provinces. So no worries, there's not 13 slides coming at you there. But this province is probably the most ambiguous of them. We are definitely in need for some updates on our Elections Act. The section on personal expenses and election expenses puts accessibility into a gray area at best. It is a case-by-case basis where you will need to specifically call Elections Newfoundland and Labrador before making any related purchases to this. Technically, translation services or something like a Braille printed election material to promote the candidate would fall under an election expense interpretation, but for things like building the ramp example, it's not so clear. Personal expenses are listed as those that are reasonably incurred by the candidate or their spouse, but childcare and supports with people with disabilities is not mentioned, and it talks that expenses are specifically during a journey for election purposes, not the day-to-day campaigning. I have also never seen a candidate successfully get childcare expensed in elections, and also when we do hear back from them, we will update the place where this webinar is housed to let you know if there have been updates on any green lights with accessibility, disability accommodations, or childcare. Nova Scotia is a bit of a gold standard. They have what's called the Canada Electoral Act Support Program, or CESP for short. It recognizes childcare, elder care, and spousal expenses, as well as expenses related to a candidate's disability. For candidates to qualify for CESP, they need to be nominated candidate in the provincial election. They sign a self-declaration that they're eligible for the benefit, and then they need to receive 10% of the valid votes in the district to get their reimbursement, like any other election expense. If candidate doesn't have any accessibility needs, but wants to have more accessibility for volunteers and voters, making materials more accessible, that can fall under the interpretation of publicity and advertising. But again, you'll need to reach out on a case-by-case basis when it comes to whether accessibility can count under headquarters expenses, because it's often the case where it's not listed out specifically in the Act. New Brunswick and PEI. First off, I am well aware of the proportions that are off there in those provinces. PEI is definitely not that big. But in New Brunswick, a candidate's childcare and accessibility expenses connected to the campaign are part of an election campaign's eligible expense and subject to the spending limit. And these expenses often do require an official agent approval before being incurred. PEI is a little trickier when it comes to childcare. So for childcare expenses to be eligible as a reimbursable election expense in PEI, the candidate needs to provide detailed childcare receipts for the month prior to the beginning of the election period and then during the election period for which they're claiming expenses. And only expenses that exceed what they normally incur are eligible for reimbursement. So if you normally spend $500 a month on childcare, but you spend $800 during the election, you'll get $300 back. Childcare costs are considered reimbursable personal expenses and are not subject to the election spending limit. And there's nothing on accessibility expenses outside of the interpreted campaign material examples that we gave for Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Now, in Quebec and Ontario, for Quebec, a candidate's personal expenses may or may not be treated as an election expense. That choice actually lies between you and your official agent. And this doesn't just include childcare, this includes housing, food, hairdressing, clothes. So this is a bit more open. When we reached out to Elections Quebec, they said that there's nothing on accessibility in elections finance for Quebec provincial elections. Now in Ontario, expenses incurred by candidates related to their disability and childcare expenses are considered a campaign expense, but are not subject to the limit. Now, in Manitoba, reasonable childcare and disability expenses are eligible election expenses subject to the expense limit and 100% reimbursable, whereas in Saskatchewan, kind of similar to Nova Scotia in that family, elder, spousal care, personal expenses, they must be reported with proof of payment. They're not to be included in the election expense calculation or subject to campaign spending limits. Accessibility expenses, they need to be approved by Election Saskatchewan on a case-by-case basis. And in speaking to their director of finance, while it's not explicitly listed in their resources, they did state that they cannot see a counter argument being made for anything that would make a campaign more accessible to other individuals like voters and volunteers. So make sure that in those situations that you are getting prior consent so you have that in writing. In Alberta, a candidate's childcare and family care expenses are additional expenses expenses related to the candidate's disability are eligible candidate expenses exempt from the campaign spending limit. BC listed nothing on childcare. We haven't heard back yet, so similar to Newfoundland and Labrador, we'll update the page this webinar is housed on once they reply. But in regards to disability, the cost of improving physical accessibility and the cost of things like implementing assistive technologies, services used for communication are eligible election expenses and are subject to the campaign expense limit. And then finally, the territories. Not explicitly stated on their website, but in speaking to Yukon's chief electoral officer, childcare and disability-related expenses can be put under personal expenses for the candidate and must be reported. So confirm this with yourself in advance in writing where it's not explicit on their website. In Northwest Territories, childcare is listed as an acceptable election expense under their goods and services, but nothing related to accessibility. And in none of it, a candidate's childcare and accessibility expenses connected to the campaign are part of the election campaign's eligible expense, but are not eligible campaign expense limits. It does require their chief electoral officer's advance written approval. So as you can see, every province and territory is different. Sometimes their online presence isn't clear. And at the time of watching this, just in case a few weeks or months have passed, make sure that you're confirming that nothing has changed between now and that date. So to cap it off, let's talk about making your election campaign accessible. And Donna already provided some fantastic examples that fall within the Elections Canada accessibility expenses. And I want to add some accessibility best practices on top of that. Some of them have cost considerations attached. Others are free and easy ways to ensure that your campaign is accessible to your community. First and foremost, account for yours, your campaign team members, and your volunteers' accessibility and dietary needs. When it comes to your campaign team members, make that one of the questions you ask in your very first meeting with them. And if possible, make sure that accessibility and dietary needs are listed on your campaign volunteer forms on top of what their preferred volunteer activities are. Sometimes, especially in rural areas, It can be hard to find a fully accessible, affordable, suitable, short-term rental space for campaign headquarters in your electoral district. You can only work with what is available. But if it's possible, always try to find the most accessible space you can, and which is a question that you can ask the person who is leasing that space, or something that you can note when you go to look at it. And it's not just, is there an automatic button at the door? It's, is there a lip between the outside and the front door that requires a small ramp? Because even 1 to 2 inches can impede a wheelchair from coming through your front entry. Are there stairs anywhere in your HQ? Is the entry wide enough for larger wheelchairs? Is the bathroom accessible? Is parking easy? Are there accessible spaces? If someone has a mobility aid and needs to turn around a 360 turnaround, are they going to get stuck because of how condensed your headquarters is? These are all the kinds of things that you can take notice of and note about your space when you rent it. Have this information on hand in case it's asked by someone who wants to visit the headquarters or volunteer there. And it's something that you can put on your candidate website by the address on the contact page. Adding accessibility details is extremely appreciated by folks who need to find out this information. It saves them the advanced time of them having to contact to find out. It shows that by giving these details, you understand the complexity of disabilities and you value accessibility. And it just shows it's more than just being able to open the door for them. Is it fully accessible? If the space isn't accessible to someone who wants to be engaged in the campaign, are there remote volunteer opportunities or other places where volunteering takes place that is accessible? Are you going to go canvass at the farmer's market? That may be a great place for them to go if that place is accessible. Having this information, especially as a campaign's volunteer lead, is important. Similarly, if you're hosting meet and greets and other types of events, make sure you get a list of accessibility features from the venue you choose. It also helps to list the nearest stations and bus stops to the event. But outside of your headquarters and your event spaces, make a point to meet community members where they are. If a prospective voter wants to talk to the candidate and they cannot enter your headquarters because it's not accessible, how can the candidate get to them? Make a point to knock on that person's door and talk there, or see if they'd like to talk over Zoom, but what it is that they prefer. Visit seniors' homes, long-term care facilities, the disabilities offices at your local post-secondary institutions, different disability-related nonprofits in your area. Promote the public events and festivals you're going to in advance. Welcome people to say hello to you as the candidate in case they may be there as well. These are all simple things you can do to be accessible. And when you're thinking about your campaign materials, there are ways in which you can keep accessibility in mind. First, you're going to want to choose an accessible layout for all of your materials. Don't make it too overwhelming. You don't have to list everything about yourself in this one document. Election materials should give the most important, pertinent information that you want the public to know about your suitability for this job. It should make people want to reach out to you and check out your website and learn more about you. Essentially, you have between when you hand them the brochure at the door and when they get to the recycling bin to catch their interest, and a wordy pamphlet will be to your disadvantage. Research shows brains prefer shorter lines between 50 to 75 characters. A shorter line is going to encourage people to read the entire page, and especially for folks with learning disabilities or neurodiversity, this is a huge help. This also goes for your website as well, by the way. So balance your text with image content, play with white space, make sure that it doesn't look too cluttered. Avoid jargon, avoid larger words. Big words don't get you elected and don't make you look smarter. In fact, it makes you look a bit more unrelatable. I'd also recommend creating a small number of materials with larger text and consider having a handful of Braille materials on hand. Related to linguistic accessibility, be aware of the languages spoken in your electoral area, and if you can, translate that material over so you can connect with those communities as well. After all, you are going to represent them when you are elected. There is a community in my province that mostly strictly speaks Inuktitut, no English, and in the last provincial election, a candidate went out of their way to translate all of their materials in Inuktitut. No other candidates did that, and that stood out. Related to that, something we go more in depth in on the campaign schools is the idea of snowflake organizing, which is mostly thought of in a geographical context, but we also look at the organizing theory for canvassing through the lens of intersectionality and demographic opportunities for volunteer engagement while building trust and rapport in communities that we may not identify with ourselves as a candidate. Also, keep color contrast in mind with your election signs, materials, social media posts, your website. Color contrast can make or break the readability for folks who are colorblind or visually impaired. I remember speaking to someone who was visually impaired in the last municipal election here, and of all the campaign signs on the roads, there was only one candidate that he could read, and that person became an automatic vote in the slate that he could choose. A good color contrast means that all viewers can see your content, no matter the device they use or the lighting of their surroundings. And if you're unsure if colors are contrasting well or not, there are a ton of free color contrast testers online. When sharing your PDF materials, try to save the PDF so that you can still drag the mouse over the words to highlight it. Don't save it as a flattened PDF. If you can highlight the words in the PDF, that means a screen reader will be able to grab the words and read it out loud. Similarly, when it comes to your website, try to have all the text on the website itself rather than having a pre-created uploaded image with the text, because it's just better for assistive technology. And when you're making your social media posts, make sure that you're adding alt text and image descriptions, which is just providing context of the image's purpose to the reader. So for example, with this picture of the woman on the TV, I might say a woman with gray hair and black glasses sitting on a beige chair by a beige wall. The closed captioning said, "This is an important decision we all need to make." That would be the caption. This is especially important for individuals who can use screen readers or other assistive technologies. And again, as Donna mentioned in hers, closed captioning on video content is important. And if you're using hashtags, capitalize each word, because otherwise it will come out as complete gibberish if someone is using a screen reader. Or if someone's quickly doom scrolling and they see it, they'll probably get an understanding of what you're trying to present much quicker. Not on this slide, make sure that you don't use too many emojis, because if you list 12 hearts in a row on a post, the screen reader will read that post and it will say heart emoticon, heart emoticon, heart emoticon. It will do that 12 times, and that will likely annoy your prospective supporter. Close to the end, if you plan to utilize online conferencing programs like Zoom, especially if you're in more remote areas or where there are many languages spoken, it may be worth it to buy the slightly larger package that includes the live closed captioning and the live translation captioning, similar to the program that we are using here live today. Avoid long links. There are a ton of free link shortener programs online, or consider using QR codes on your print materials. I've also seen folks have little lanyards with the QR code around their neck that just allows someone to scan their phone to go straight to the candidate's website super quickly. This makes things more accessible as well. And last but not least, utilize Elections Canada resources as a way to educate voters about the supports that are available to them. You can even do a social media post educating the general public around what options are available and supports are available to them. There are tons of services that folks who need accessibility supports can request in advance or are available as needed. And I have shown here on the slide just how you can navigate that on their website. You'll find it under voters and then the accessibility tab. All right. So with that, I'm going to bring up Miss Betsy MacDonald. And Betsy is the former federal NDP candidate for Central Nova Scotia in 2021. She'll share a bit about her experience in utilizing the childcare expense, and then from there, we will open it up to questions. So over to you, Betsy.
Thanks, Courtney, and hi, everybody. Nice to see you all here. So yes, my name is Betsy MacDonald. I'm in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki. You might know of Antigonish as the home of St. Francis Xavier University, which is where I happen to work currently. And yeah, so I was a federal candidate in two consecutive elections, 2019 and 2021, in the riding of Central Nova. And my daughter was 7 and 9 for those elections, and I'm a single parent. So, the thought of even running was daunting, given, that I knew it would be a big challenge with my daughter, but I went for it nonetheless. And so, yeah, I was the NDP candidate. We were unsuccessful both times, although we did increase our vote share in the second election, which was a victory unto itself. Just to give you a sense of the riding, so Central Nova is a very big rural riding. It's approximately the same size as Prince Edward Island, just to give you a sense of the geographic scope. It's huge. Like, it takes about 2.5 hours to drive from one end of the riding to the other. And in both cases, we were a very small team. In the last election, the federal election came right on the heels of a provincial election, and so volunteers, from all parties, were tired and burnt out, and it really compromised everybody's capacity to just kind of turn around and go right into a federal election. So I ended up essentially managing my own campaign in addition to being the candidate, with the support of a small group of people. So the biggest challenges, as you can imagine, in a mostly rural riding of this size, were that the time that it took just to get around, to canvass, to go to all candidates' meetings, to put up signs, to make appearances in different communities and at different events, to show visibility and show that we were campaigning everywhere and not just in my home community. So, as you can imagine, it was a pretty time-consuming schedule for me as a candidate. And although my daughter was in school, there was definitely a lot of campaign activity that took place outside of school hours. And although my partner was very supportive, and I had family who were supporting me too, it just wasn't enough because the demand was so great, and and we wanted to do well, and so we wanted to kind of maximize the time I was able to give to the campaign. So we ended up leaning quite a bit on a babysitter, like our babysitter, who we had a long-standing relationship with, and basically we approached her and asked her if she would be able to take on some additional time with my child during the election, and she was available. And so we hired her to provide a good chunk of support during that period. And what it meant for me was I was able to do things that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. I was able to get to more events. I was able to talk to more voters. Our little team was able to put up more signs. It just kind of made that much more possible. And it also greatly diminished the stress that I felt while campaigning, because I knew that my child was in good hands and happy and doing artwork and all kinds of fun stuff. Yeah, and it was still hard. I mean, being a candidate is hard, especially federally, but just knowing that the support was there made a big difference. I think that it's our elected bodies are supposed to be made up of people from all walks of life, and unfortunately that too often isn't the case, because there are just so many barriers to even getting involved, let alone running and winning. And so to see the support that is available just to make that experience more accessible for people just really speaks to how how important it is. Like democracy just doesn't just happen when you let everybody vote. Like it has to be fostered by actually giving everybody a chance to participate. And it's wonderful to see Elections Canada and Equal Voice and the provincial bodies, doing the work, even though it's always a work in progress to make that possible. Yeah, so I think that's mostly what I wanted to talk about. So maybe I will pass the mic back to Courtney.
Thank you so much. That was there were so many good lines. I loved when you talked about how democracy has to be fostered, and you're right, it is a continual work in progress. And it's just so good to see the commitment across Canada of trying to make this a bit more accessible for everybody. So I'm bringing everybody back up on the screen here now. And if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or the Q&A. We do have two already, and it looks like they are federally related questions. So let's see. So in the Q&A for Donna, does the accessibility expense for federal elections also apply to language translations to make campaign materials accessible in different spoken languages, or is it specifically disability related accessibility?
The accessibility expense is specifically disability related expense, but the cost for translation of election material would be a campaign expense. And if it's used during the election period, it would be an election expense. But it wouldn't fall under accessibility.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification, Donna. And we also have a question from Ian, who is in the South Shore St. Margaret's riding. Thanks for joining us, Ian. Are the accessibility and childcare expenses, and this is federally a federal question, are they only available to candidates, or are volunteers and staff also included?
Well, those specific expenses are only available for the childcare, and the expenses related to a disability fall under candidates' personal expenses. So that would relate only to the candidate themselves. However, if the campaign expenses, the definition is a very broad definition. It's an expense reasonably incurred as an incident of the election. So if the campaign is looking at paying for expenses for childcare for their campaign workers, there may be, you would want to check on the situation and see whether it would apply or not, whether it would qualify as a campaign expense. In terms of the accessibility expenses, that is dealing with voters and campaign workers. So that would apply as to everyone, not just the candidate.
Awesome. And I see a question from Maria in the chat. I don't have the specific number on hand for Ontario limits, but I will grab that after the webinar and I'll get that to you by email, Maria. So that'll come your way as soon as I get the answer from them, or if it's on their website. But I'll get that to you. Any other questions? It's a very drilled down topic, so. It doesn't seem so. Well, if there's anyone who's watching this later on in the future, or if you think of something and you after this ends and you want to ask it, it's only an email away. But I would like to thank everyone who joined us today for this quick lunch and learn on childcare and accessibility expenses. We will have it housed on our website under the resources section within a few business days. I will email you with all the copies of the presentation PDFs, the link to the video, as well as some infographics around the expense usage. In the meantime, follow us on our socials for Equal Voice, Elections Canada. And I know, Betsy MacDonald, you are also a talented musician on top of being a former federal candidate. So check her out too. Thank you, Donna and Betsy, for joining us today and sharing your angles on this topic. And thank you all for joining us in the audience. We will be hosting a deep dive campaign school online in November. So stay tuned for that. And if you are in Whitehorse, I will be up that way in mid-October. So I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Bye.